Oh, wait, I got a question. You focus on Averell Harriman and Ed Murrow and a guy who's almost unknown today, U.S. Ambassador to Britain, John Gilbert Wynant, who was perhaps the most crucial. Wynant succeeded the defeatist and aloof Joe Kennedy. What do you think the world would look like today if that little pack of Americans in London had managed to convince people back home much earlier that Hitler was an extremely bad dude who had to be stopped, and U.S. Armed Forces had joined Britain and the French Free Forces at the outset?
That's a great what-if question. I'm not sure. It just wasn't in the cards that that was going to happen. The book is really a behind-the-scenes look at the partnership between the U.S. and Great Britain during World War II, with these three Americans as the main characters. One reason I'm writing about them, or wrote about them, is that they were really key players in the whole debate in 1940 and 1941 over whether Britain should be saved. Britain at that time was the last country in Europe holding out against Hitler, desperately in need of American aid, was really close to defeat. I mean, was hanging on by the skin of their teeth at that time. They needed American aid, but American aid was incredibly skimpy. And that was true until Pearl Harbor, until well into 1942. So these three Americans, and there were others, based in London, did everything they could to not only get more American aid, but to get American public opinion changed. Edward R. Murrow being the great CBS correspondent in London, who really tried to sway, and did in fact sway, American public opinion to a great degree. Averell Harriman back then was this hard-charging, elbows-out, multimillionaire businessman who had been sent over by Franklin Roosevelt to be in charge of Lend-Lease aid for Britain. And Gil Wynant, as you said, Mort, was this guy who replaced Joseph Kennedy as ambassador to Great Britain. That, by the way, it was not a hard act to follow, Joe Kennedy, who was an appeasement-minded ambassador, who was a pal of Neville Chamberlain's, who thought that Britain was going to be defeated. He was a businessman, first and foremost, and he really thought business in the U.S. and everywhere else was going to suffer unless some accommodation was made with Hitler. So he tried very hard to get FDR and the American government not to give anything to Britain. He really thought Britain was going to be defeated. And so he basically poisoned the well between these two countries. He poisoned the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill. He told Roosevelt he couldn't stand Churchill, for one thing, Kennedy, and Churchill couldn't stand Kennedy. But Kennedy would tell Roosevelt that Churchill was a drunk, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he was an imperialist. And so things were pretty dark, not least of which because of Joe Kennedy. So Wynant had a big job, a very difficult job to fill when he came over.
What was going on back here in Washington and in the rest of the country that was making people so isolationist and so, you know, and as we always say in times like this, oh, there's a big ocean, you know, and when it was so clear, what had to be done?
Well, it was clear to some people, but it wasn't clear to most Americans at that time. I mean, I think the fact that there were two oceans on either side of this country played a big role. I mean, the war was 3,000 miles away, more than 3,000 miles away, and many people didn't see the urgency, the need for us to go to the brink of war in order to help the British, or even to go to war. There was a lot of isolationism, still a lot of anti-British feeling in the country. You know, I grew up in the West, and I went to school here at the U of A, and I've been an Anglophile all my life. I mean, I've loved everything about England. I loved the literature, everything. And I thought, well, everybody is an Anglophile. And I soon found out that wasn't true, but I really found out, doing research for this book, how deep the anti-British feeling was in this country. American industry didn't want to produce wartime goods at that point. They weren't forced to by Roosevelt at that stage because we weren't in the war. There was no force at all. So they had finally started making money after the Depression, and not surprisingly, they wanted to keep making money. So you know, there was no great push within the country. Roosevelt himself clearly wanted to help England. There's no question, but he was very loath to get ahead of public opinion. He was very cautious. He wanted very much not to get into the war if he could help it. So while Britain was, you know, being bombed, while German submarines were strangling British supply lines, you know, America wasn't sending over much stuff at that point.
You know, and when they did, I mean, those, what, 50, 60 ships they sent over from World War II, these, I mean, they were, you know, rat infested and holes in the hulls, and I mean, they only could use a couple of them. I mean, how, you know, and then they're making the Brits pay for them.
That's right.
I mean, how did they get away with that?
Well, I mean, there was a great amount, there was a great sense of the British tricked us into World War I, and we weren't going to let that happen again. That if we were going to help England, Britain, then we were going to, it wasn't going to be strict altruistic aid. I mean, we were going to basically make them pay for it, and which we did. All the aid up to Lend-Lease, when we're talking about 1940, early 1941, the British had to pay for it. It was cash and carry. So the destroyers, these, as you say, the World War I age destroyers, which the British really couldn't use, they got them in exchange for British bases in a number of British territories. So it was a much better deal for the U.S. Than for Britain, which Winston Churchill well knew and which he was really furious about. But that is really the only way that Roosevelt thought he could sell this aid to the American people, that we were getting something for it, you know, that it wasn't just helping the British.
Right. You know, beneath its wholesome, studious exterior, this book is pretty racy. Tell us about Ed Murrow's sex life and Pamela Harriman and Winans' thing for Churchill's daughter.
Well, I have to back up here. I mean, it's not just thrown in there. Just
kidding. No. But it is in there, and it's really interesting, and it's germane to the story. So
it's very germane to the story because Winston Churchill was brilliant at wooing people that he needed. He knew that these three men, Winant, Harriman, and Murrow, were key, were crucial to the survival of his country. They were very, very important Americans that he needed on his side. So he brought them into his official family, first of all. His door was open for Ed Murrow. I mean, Ed Murrow would drop in at 10 Downing Street for a couple of, you know, Churchill would come out and wave him in and say, do you have time for several whiskeys? And so he and Murrow would sit and have whiskeys and talk. He included Winant and Harriman even more because they were government officials and he really needed them. So he made himself available to them in ways that had never happened before. He made himself available and he made members of his government available. But the really interesting thing that goes to what you're saying, Mort, is that he made them part of his own personal family as well. They really were, especially Winant and Harriman, were de facto members of the Churchill family. They spent many if not most, weekends with the Churchills at the various country houses that they would go to during the war. And their relationship was so close that all three of them did have wartime affairs with members of Churchill's family. Winant with Sarah Churchill, who is Churchill's middle daughter, his favorite daughter, and Harriman and Murrow with Pamela Churchill, who was the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law. She was married to Randolph Churchill, who was obviously Winston's son. I should add that it was not at the same, these affairs were not at the same time. It was not, I mean, London was a fairly romantic city, but not quite that much. They were sequential affairs. But it goes to the aura of London during that time. I mean, anything went in London. You know, it was an incredibly exciting, vibrant city. In fact, probably the most exciting city in the war, during the war in the world. And that it wasn't just Murrow, Winant, and Harriman. It was going on, you know, all over the place. I mean, there was a real carpe diem mentality. You know, live for the day, for tomorrow you may die.